Good morning. Can everyone hear me? All right, well, there we go. Happy Mother's Day to all the mothers out there. So today's text, I think, needs some placing. I feel like if we just jump right in, you might be a little bit lost. So the text we have before us is a prayer. It's the middle portion of a prayer. It's a prayer from Jesus to God for the disciples. And this prayer takes place in the final hours that Jesus has with the disciples. This is their last night together. Jesus has washed their feet, they've shared a meal, and now he's praying for them. I'm sure all of you who have taken your kids to college, you know that feeling, that final moment with your kids and you're trying to squeeze that last prayer in. It's sort of, I think, what's going on here. It's the longest prayer that we have that Jesus shares. And even though that the prayer is for the disciples, I think that the prayer is for us. So I encourage all of you to listen that this prayer that Jesus is saying to God is not only for the disciples, it's for us. So let us now listen for the word of the Lord. I have made your name known to those whom you have given me from the world. They were yours. You gave me them to me, and you have kept your word. Now that everything you have given me is from you, for the words you have given to me, I have given to them. They have received them, knowing in the truth I came from you, and they have believed that you sent me. I am asking on their behalf. I am not asking on the behalf of the world, but on the behalf of whom you have given me, because they are yours. All mine are yours. Yours are mine. I have glorified them in them. Now I am no longer in the world. They are in the world. And I am coming to you, Holy Father. Protect them in your name that you have given me, so that they may be one as we are one. While I was with them, I protected them in your name that you have given me. I have guarded them. Not one of them was lost, except the one destined to be lost, so the scripture may be fulfilled. But now I am coming to you. I speak these things in the world so that they may have my joy complete in themselves. I have given them your word. The world has hated them because they do not belong to the world, just as I do not belong to the world. I am not asking you to take them out of the world, but I'm asking you to protect them from the evil one. They do not belong to the world, just as I do not belong to the world. Sanctify them in the truth. Your word is the truth. As you have sent me into the world, I have sent them into the world. For their sake, sanctify myself, so they also may be sanctified in the truth. The word of the Lord. So when Pastor Lou first came to this church, we had a meeting to discuss the church and my role. And at the conclusion of that meeting, Pastor Lou said, "Hey, did you ever want to preach again?" And I told him, "I don't think I ever want to preach again for this church." Yet here we are. I think that conversation went a little differently for Pastor Lou because, as you can see, I was his first call. The passage that we have from the Gospel of John is a rich one. It's one of those passages that I feel each verse could be its own sermon. So, for the interest of time, I want to be laser focused, unless anyone objects and wants to be here all day. I want to focus on one verse. And more importantly, I want to focus on a key phrase within this verse. I want to focus on verse 11. There's several different translations of this verse that it seems like people can't agree on. The first translation that I read was, "I will remain in the world no longer, but they are still in the world. I am coming to you, O Holy Father. Protect them by the power of your name, the name you gave me, so that they may be one as we are." The second one is, "And now I am no longer in the world, but they are in the world. I am coming to you, Holy Father. Protect them in your name that you have given to me, so that they may be one as we are." And the third one is, "I am no longer in the world, but they are in the world. I am coming to you, Holy Father. Keep them in your name, which you have given me, so that they may be one even as we were one." Other ones I heard was keep them in the knowledge of your name. Maintain them in the knowledge of your name. Hold them in the name. As you can see, the key phrase within this verse that the translators seem to not disagree on is the middle part. Protect them by the power of your name. Protect them in the name that you have given me. Keep them in your name, which you have given me. I think regardless of how you translate it and wherever you sit on that, I think more or less the translation points to the same thing. Jesus' prayer to God is that the disciples, and more importantly to us, that we take on the identity of God's name and the characteristics of God's name and lead a life that is reflective of that truth. That is the central message I have for you today. That Jesus' prayer for us to God is that we take on God's name and the characteristics of God's name and lead a life that is reflective of that truth. And before we totally unpack that statement, I think we need to back up a little and think about the concept of name and how a name shapes one's identity. You see, in my family, my parents did a peculiar thing. All of our legals' names do not match the names we go by. My older sister is named Ann Thode, but her whole life she's been named or goes by Annie. My legal name is Edward Thode. Before you're like, wait, no, Ted Kennedy was also Edward Kennedy, so I have a Kennedy on my side. So I go by Ted or Teddy. My younger sister, her name is Elizabeth, but everyone calls her Betsy. My wife thinks this is like totally ridiculous. And we were under strict orders that when it came to naming our kids, this was not going to happen. And I have to admit, I think it is a little bit odd, but I think it speaks to naming something can be complicated. And how you figure all that can be complicated. It's not that simple. I also think when you think of someone's name and you get to know that person and you spend time with that person and you learn things about that person and the traits they have, that shapes how you look at a name. You know, when you think of someone who's really good looking and really funny and really smart and happens to be named Ted, every time you hear the word Ted, you're going to think of someone who's really good looking, who's really smart, who's really funny, right? Right? And I don't think I'm alone, right? I think that this is a common human experience. And moreover, when you see a name and the name is something, it can invoke a response. When you're in the grocery store and you're proudly wearing that MSU, someone might hit you with that Go Green, and you're going to hit them with the Go White. Or if you're wearing that Michigan and they say Go Blue. I mean, names invoke something. And I got to just say, like, when you're on vacation, I always search out a Michigan State person because I always hit them with that. There's nothing more exhilarating than that, right? Even though I want to be clear, I don't pick sides here. I just call them like I see them. But I think a name is more a name. I think it represents characteristics. It represents something about that person. It says something to the world. And it stirs up emotion. It stirs up feelings. When we see names, it matters. And so when we think about that, I think we now turn back to the text. We notice that Jesus' prayer is clear. That Jesus wants us to take on God's name. And when we hear God's name, the thing that jumps right out at us is the central truth of the gospel, right? The idea that Jesus died on the cross for our sins and our faith in that and what we get. But I think that can be overwhelming. I think that can be a lot. It's hard for us to kind of wrap our heads around that. So I think we need to break it down a little bit more. When we think of God's names, we think of the characteristics of God. We think about love. We think about forgiveness. We think about inclusion. We think about being concerned with the marginalized. We think about being concerned with people who are struggling with health issues, whether it's mental or physical. We think about being an advocate for the oppressed. We think about being a warrior for justice. And when we do this, and we think about these characteristics, I think these are the characteristics that Christ wants us to take on. And I want to acknowledge, and I don't want to get too carried away, because I think sometimes we're like, wait, Jesus wants us to take on these characteristics. But God is God. I'm just a member of this church. I'm never going to be God. I'm never going to be a perfect Christian. I'm never going to be all-knowing. I'm never going to be this super church member. I'm just a person who's trying to get through life. And I think that that's okay. God's prayer is for us to take on God's characteristics. But I think it's important to understand that comes with grace. I'm not trying to say that we need to be like God. But what I'm trying to say is, what if we try a little bit to represent God's love? What if we try a little bit to represent God's forgiveness? What if we try a little bit to represent God's compassion? What if we try to represent God's inclusion? What if we try to be an advocate for the oppressed and the marginalized? And I think this little effort can transform our lives, it can transform this church, and it can transform this world. And the next thing I want to acknowledge, you may be sitting here and you're saying, wait. You seem to be implying that I have some agency here. But in reality, in the text before us, this is a conversation between Jesus and God, where Christ is praying that we take on these things. But where is God in all this? Shouldn't this be a God thing? If God wanted us to take on God's characteristics, shouldn't God have tried a little harder? Maybe God shouldn't allow us to be annoyed with that person. Shouldn't God not allow us to have these doubts? And ultimately, maybe God should have just been a better God. And I think we worship a God that is big enough to handle those feelings. And I think that's okay. You know, being a follower of Christ, being a follower of God, doesn't mean that God can't handle those feelings of self-doubt. But I think it's also, if we're given the opportunity to hear a prayer by someone we know and trust, wouldn't we want that prayer to be answered? What I'm saying is, if we're allowed to hear this prayer between Jesus and God, I feel like that should stir up something within inside of us. Our knowledge that this prayer exists and that it happens, that should make a difference in our lives. That should create feelings. That should make us want to do something. So let's see if we can love a little bit more. Let's see if we can be more compassionate. Let's see if we can offer more forgiveness. Let's see if we can offer more grace. Let's see if we can really fulfill this prayer. I want to share a story that I think paints a picture of what I'm talking about. And I chose a simple story of how you can live out this prayer because I didn't want it to make it seem like it's fancy or groundbreaking. I wanted to see something that is tangible, that we can all do. And I want to be clear that this is a story I heard from another pastor, and that's not a personal experience. So this pastor was at this lock-in, and he's sitting there with a bunch of high school girls, and there's these two girls, Beth and Lucy. And they're all talking, and all of a sudden Beth starts talking about how she really doesn't like school, and how she feels alone at school, and how she feels just not seen at school, and school is not a place where she feels welcome. And that she's really vulnerable in this moment. And the pastor's unsure what to say. He thinks maybe this is a good time to offer the Lord's Prayer. He thinks maybe this is a good time to cite a Bible passage. He's really at a loss to what to say, and he's kind of panicking a little. And before he could say something, Lucy speaks up, and she says, "You know, Beth, I love that you come to this church, and I love that you're a part of this church, and I have so much fun spending time with you." And before the pastor could respond, Beth replied, "I know. That's why I love coming to church. Church is different." You see, I think the pastor got caught up in trying to be the perfect Christian. They were so caught up in being concerned with the perfect response that they missed the big picture. They didn't realize that their behavior of modeling God's love, and more importantly, creating a space where others can model God's love, is enough. And this is the central truth of the story, that when we live our lives with the hope that God's love is being reflected, that things are different. And more importantly, I share this story again to show how tangible this can be, how simple this can be. Is that my concern is that sometimes this notion of trying to embody the characteristics of God sounds cheesy, sounds unimaginable, sounds unrealistic. But for me, this story shows that this is not true. Loving others can be easy. Oh, God. Well, I need to pause. Sometimes it's not easy to talk, I guess. But loving others can be easy. Having forgiveness and compassion for others can be easy. Being inclusive can be easy. Being a voice for the voiceless can be easy. And if you're sitting here today and you're saying, look, I don't want easy. I want my life to be transformed. Well, this is what the church is for. The church is for a place for you to come and figure out how you can transform your lives. And so if you're looking for a way where you can take this to another level, I encourage you to reach out to Pastor Lou and tell him, I'm ready to take on God's name and I need help. We as a church are here to help you through this. Friends, God's prayer to us is that we take on God's name. So let us do what we can and make this prayer a reality. Amen.